It happened in the middle of July, at 2 in the afternoon, with the sun sitting directly above my garden like a spotlight on a crime scene. 1 hour earlier, my tomato plants looked perfect. Thick stems. Dark green leaves. Fruit is just starting to blush red. Then I walked outside with a glass of water and stopped in the doorway, because something was wrong. The leaves were drooping. Not wilting from heat, not the normal afternoon sag. They were collapsing, folding in on themselves like they were trying to disappear into the ground. By evening, 3 plants were dead, their stems already turning soft and dark at the base, as if something invisible had reached up from below and pulled the life straight out of them. And underneath that soil, completely invisible to me at the time, something strange was already taking place. Something that, months later, would completely change the way I understood gardening, and would make me question almost everything I thought I knew about keeping a tomato plant alive. This wasn't the first summer this happened. It was the third. Every spring, I would do everything right. Rich compost mixed into the beds. Mulch spread 2 inches thick. A drip irrigation line running on a timer so consistent you could set your watch by it. I followed advice from books, from extension office pamphlets, from gardeners who had 30 years of dirt under their fingernails. And every single July, like clockwork, my tomatoes would start dying. Not all at once. Just enough to break my heart slowly, one wilted plant at a time. I told myself it was bad luck, a rough patch, nothing more than chance. I told myself it was just a hard climate, one I couldn't control no matter how hard I tried. But deep down, I knew something didn't add up, because gardening isn't supposed to feel like rolling dice every single year and hoping the weather shows you mercy. Here's what made it so maddening. My neighbor, 2 houses down, grew tomatoes in soil that looked worse than mine. Rockier. Sandier. Less compost, less care, less attention, and certainly no drip irrigation timer running like clockwork the way mine did. And her plants survived the same brutal heat that kept killing mine. I watered more than her. I fed my plants more than her. I babied every single leaf. So why was I losing the war while she won it without even trying? I started taking notes, comparing watering schedules, soil temperatures, even the angle of the sun across our yards. Nothing explained it. The deeper I looked, the less sense it made, until I started wondering if the answer wasn't above the soil at all, but buried somewhere beneath it, in a place I had never once thought to check. That's when I stumbled across a comment on an old gardening forum, buried in a thread that had nothing to do with tomatoes. Someone mentioned burying logs and branches underneath their vegetable beds. Not composting them. Not chipping them. Burying them whole, like a strange wooden coffin under the soil. My first reaction was almost laughter. Would take years to break down. Wouldn't it just rot and attract pests? Wouldn't it steal nitrogen from my plants instead of helping them? It sounded like one of those internet myths that gets repeated until people start believing it's science. I almost closed the tab, but one sentence in that comment stuck with me, and I couldn't stop thinking about it, even hours later while doing something completely unrelated. The sentence mentioned something about old European farmers who buried timber before planting, especially in regions where summers turned brutal and dry. So I went looking, and what I found surprised me. Indigenous farming traditions in parts of North America and Eastern Europe had used buried wood and brush beneath garden mounds for generations, long before anyone called it a method or gave it a name. They weren't doing it for nitrogen or fancy soil science. They were doing it because it worked, season after season, in ways their grandparents had already discovered through trial and failure. Nobody wrote papers about it. Nobody made videos. It just quietly worked, hidden in plain sight, for longer than modern gardening books have even existed, which made me wonder how much other useful knowledge we have simply stopped passing down. The more I researched, the clearer one thing became. My soil was drying out faster than I realized, not just on the surface, but several inches down where the roots actually needed moisture most. Every hot afternoon, water was disappearing from the root zone almost as fast as I poured it in. My plants weren't dying from heat exactly. They were dying from thirst that my watering schedule couldn't keep up with. And buried wood, it turns out, behaves like a hidden reservoir underground, slowly absorbing and releasing moisture over time. But that was only part of the story. There was something else happening down there too, something involving fungi, bacteria, and a slow transformation I never expected, a process that had nothing to do with anything written on the back of my fertilizer bag. Still, the idea of digging a deep trench and burying actual logs under my prized tomato bed felt absurd. I pictured my dad's face if he saw me doing it. I pictured myself explaining to a neighbor why there were branches sticking out of freshly turned soil. But I was tired. Tired of losing plants every July, tired of watching months of work collapse in a single heat wave. So one Saturday morning, instead of buying more fertilizer, I drove to a lumber yard and a local tree service and asked for something I never thought I'd request out loud. Old, rotting wood nobody wanted, the kind most people pay to have hauled away. I dug a trench almost 2 feet deep, deeper than any planting hole I had ever made, and it felt wrong the entire time. Into that trench went chunks of half-rotted log, smaller branches, and partially decomposed bark, layered like some strange underground lasagna. On top of that went a mix of compost, then soil, mounded back up into a raised bed shape. By the time I finished, my back was sore, my hands were blistered, and I genuinely wondered if I had just buried my entire growing season under a pile of useless logs, the kind of mistake that would take an entire summer to undo. I planted my tomato seedlings into that mound with more doubt than hope, and then I waited, checking on them almost every day like a nervous parent watching for a fever to break. The first 2 weeks looked completely normal, which honestly disappointed me. I think part of me wanted instant magic. But then I noticed something odd. The soil on that mound stayed slightly cooler to the touch in the early afternoon, even under direct sun. The seedlings seemed to bounce back faster after watering, almost like the ground itself was holding onto moisture longer than my other beds. I couldn't explain it yet, and I wasn't ready to celebrate. A few cooler inches of dirt didn't prove anything. Summer hadn't even started fighting back yet, and I had a feeling the real test was still ahead of me, waiting somewhere in the worst week of July. By the last week of June, the heat turned serious. Temperatures climbed past 95 degrees for nearly 10 days straight, the kind of stretch that had destroyed my plants in previous years almost on schedule. I watched the forecast with a strange mix of dread and curiosity, like waiting for a storm you can't avoid. My older tomato beds, the ones without buried wood, started showing the familiar signs. Leaves curling at the edges. Stems looking tired by mid-afternoon. I walked past my buried wood bed almost afraid to look, bracing myself for the same collapse I had seen 3 summers in a row, half expecting the wood experiment to have failed quietly while I wasn't watching. But it didn't collapse. While my other plants drooped under the afternoon sun, the tomatoes growing above that buried wood stood upright, leaves dark green, stems firm, almost defiant against the heat. I actually crouched down and touched the soil to check if I had somehow rigged the watering system without remembering. I hadn't. The same drip line, the same schedule, the same blazing sun, yet 2 completely different outcomes happening just a few feet apart in my own backyard. For the first time in 3 years, my tomato plants survived the hottest week of summer without a single casualty, and I stood there staring at the dirt like it had just whispered a secret only it understood. A secret I suddenly couldn't wait to dig into further. The explanation, once I finally understood it, felt almost embarrassingly simple, the kind of answer that makes you wonder why nobody mentioned it sooner. Buried wood acts like a sponge underground, soaking up excess water after rain or irrigation, then slowly releasing it back into the surrounding soil as conditions dry out. As fungi break that would down over months and years, they create networks that improve how water and nutrients move through the soil, while also generating gentle heat from decomposition that can buffer root temperatures. The wood doesn't feed the plant directly at first. It builds an underground support system, a hidden infrastructure of moisture and microbial life that most gardeners never think to create, because most gardeners only think about what they put on top of the soil, never what they hide beneath it, never the quiet machinery running just out of sight. This is exactly why so many people keep fighting the same losing battle every summer. We obsess over watering frequency, fertilizer brands, and sun exposure, while ignoring the structure of the soil itself. We treat dirt like an empty container instead of a living system that needs architecture, not just additives. Most garden advice focuses on what happens above ground because that's what we can see. But the real war for survival during a heat wave is fought inches below the surface, in a place most people never bother to build anything that lasts. Without that underground support, even perfect watering eventually loses against a long enough dry spell, no matter how disciplined or attentive the gardener standing above it might be. What changed for me wasn't just one good tomato season. It was realizing how much of gardening success depends on things we never see and rarely consider. I had spent 3 years blaming the sun, blaming bad luck, blaming a difficult climate, when the real problem was sitting quietly beneath my feet the entire time. Now, before I plant anything new, I think less about what nutrients to add and more about what kind of foundation I'm building underground. It's a slower, less glamorous way to garden, but it's the difference between fighting nature every July and finally working with it instead, a shift that feels small on the surface and enormous underneath it. Looking back, the strangest part isn't that buried wood saved my tomatoes. It's that the answer was something gardeners quietly understood generations before fertilizer bags and irrigation timers ever existed, and somewhere along the way, most of us simply forgot to look down. We keep searching for solutions in bottles and bags, convinced that more water or more chemicals will finally fix what keeps dying every summer, when sometimes the real fix has been buried, literally, right beneath our feet the whole time. The next time your garden struggles through a heat wave, ask yourself what's actually happening in the soil you can't see, because that invisible world might be the only thing standing between a thriving harvest and another summer of watching everything quietly die, and that, more than any trick or hack, is the real secret worth remembering.